Local loop unbundling is the regulatory process of allowing multiple telecommunications operators to use connections from the telephone exchange to the customer's premises. The physical wire connection between the local exchange and the customer is known as a local loop, and is owned by the incumbent local exchange carrier. To increase competition, other providers are granted unbundled access. Policy background: ALll is generally opposed by the ILECs, which in most cases are either former investor-owned or state-owned monopoly enterprises forced to open themselves to competition. ILECs argue that ALll amounts to a regulatory taking, that they are forced to provide competitors with essential business inputs, that ALll stifles infrastructure-based competition and technical innovation because new entrants prefer to parasitize the incumbent's network instead of building their own, and that the regulatory interference required to make ALll work is detrimental to the market. New entrants, on the other hand, argue that since they cannot economically duplicate the incumbent's local loop, they cannot actually provide certain services, such as ADSL without ALll, thus allowing the incumbent to monopolize the respective potentially competitive market, and stifle innovation. They point out that alternative access technologies, such as wireless local loop, have proven uncompetitive and/or impractical, and that under current pricing models, the incumbent is in many cases, depending on the regulatory model, guaranteed a fair price for the use of its facilities, including an appropriate return on investment. Finally, they argue that the ILECs generally did not construct their local loop in a competitive, risky, market environment, but under legal monopoly protection and using taxpayers' money, which means, according to the new entrants, that ILECs ought not to be entitled to continue to extract regulated rates of return, which often include monopoly rents from the local loop. Most industrially developed nations, including the USA, Australia and the European Union member states, and India have introduced regulatory frameworks providing for ALll. Given the above-mentioned problems, regulators face the challenging task of regulating a market that is changing very rapidly, without stifling any type of innovation, and without improperly disadvantaging any competitor. The process has been long. The first action in the EU resulted from a report written for the European Commission in 1993. It took several years for the EU legislation to require unbundling, and then in individual EU countries the process took further time to mature to become practical and economic rather than simply being a legal possibility. In 1996 the United States Telecommunication Act defined the unbundled access as the duty to provide, to any requesting telecommunications carrier for the provision of a telecommunications service, non-discriminatory access to network elements on an unbundled basis at any technically feasible point on rates, terms, and conditions that are just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory in accordance with the terms and conditions of the agreement and the requirements of this section in Section 252. An incumbent local exchange carrier shall provide such unbundled network elements in a manner that allows requesting carriers to combine such elements in order to provide such telecommunications service. The 1993 report referred to the logical requirement to unbundle optical fiber access but recommended deferral to a later date when fiber access had become more common. In 2006 there were the first signs that policy may yet evolve in this direction. Unbundling developments around the world. World Trade Organization some provisions of WTO telecommunications law can be read to require unbundling. Sect 5A of the GATS Annex on Telecommunications requires WTO members to guarantee service suppliers access to and use of public telecommunications transport networks for the supply of a service. New entrants argue that without ALll they cannot supply services such as ADSL. Sec 2.2b of the 1998 reference paper, to which some members have subscribed, requires sufficiently unbundled interconnection with major providers. However, the paper's definition of interconnection appears to exclude ALll. Sect 1 of the reference paper requires members to maintain appropriate measures for the purpose of preventing major suppliers from engaging in or continuing anti-competitive practices. New entrants argue that such practices include not giving competitors access to facilities essential to market entry, such as the local loop. The question has not been settled before a WTO judicial body, and, at any rate, these obligations only apply where the respective WTO member has committed itself to open its basic telecommunications market to competition. About 80 members have done so since 1998. India ALll has not been implemented in Indian cities yet. However, BSNL recently stated that it will open up its copper loops for private participation. In addition to this, the proliferation of WiMAX and cable broadband has increased broadband penetration and market competition. By 2008 the price war had reduced basic broadband prices to 250 Indian rupees, including line rental without any long-term contracts. In rural areas, the state player, BSNL, is still the leading, and often the only supplier. Although BSNL is a monopoly, it is used as a tool to ensure competition by the government. European Union The implementation of local loop unbundling is a requirement of European Union policy on competition in the telecommunications sector and has been introduced, at various stages of development, in all member states. Reference offer for unbundled access to their local loops and related facilities. The offer shall be sufficiently unbundled so that the beneficiary does not have to pay for network elements or facilities which are not necessary for the supply of his services, and shall contain a description of the components of the offer, associated terms and conditions, including charges. European states that have been approved for membership to the EU have an obligation to introduce ALll as part of the liberalisation of their communications sector. United Kingdom. By January 14, 2006, 210,000 local loop connections had been unbundled from BT operation under local loop unbundling. Ofcom had hoped that 1 million local loop connections would be unbundled by June 2006. However, as reported by the Register, on June 15, 2006, a figure had reached only 500,000, but was growing by 20,000 a week. Ofcom announced in November 2006 that 1 million connections had been unbundled. By April 2007, a figure was 2 million. By June 2006, AOL UK had unbundled 100,000 lines through its £120 million investment, making it the largest single ALll operator in the UK market. On October 10, 2006, Carphone Warehouse announced the purchase of AOL UK, the leading ALll operator, for £370 million. This made Carphone Warehouse the third largest broadband provider and the largest ALll operator with more than 150,000 ALll customers. On May 8, 2009, TalkTalk, who were owned by the Carphone Warehouse, announced that they would purchase ALll Tiscali UK's assets for £235 million. On June 30, 2009, Tiscali sold its UK subsidiary to the Carphone Warehouse following regulatory approval from the European Union. This purchase made TalkTalk the biggest home broadband supplier in the UK, with 4.25 million home broadband subscribers, compared with BT's 3.9 million. The service was rebranded as TalkTalk in January 2010. Most ALll operators only unbundle the broadband service, leaving the traditional telephone service using BT's core equipment. Where the traditional telephone service is also unbundled, operators usually prohibit the facility where selected calls can be made using the networks of other telephone providers. These calls can usually still be made by using an 0800 or other non-geographic access code. Although regulators in the UK admitted that the market could provide competitive offerings in due time, the purpose of mandatory local loop unbundling in the United Kingdom was to speed the delivery of advanced services to consumers. United States Pursuant to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the Federal Communications Commission requires that ILECs lease local loops to competitors. Prices are set through a market mechanism. New Zealand The Commerce Commission recommended against local loop unbundling in late 2003 as Telecom New Zealand offered a market-led solution. In May 2004 this was confirmed by the government, despite the intense call for change campaign by some of Telecom's competitors. Part of Telecom's commitment to the Commerce Commission to avoid unbundling was a promise to deliver 250,000 new residential broadband connections by the end of 2005, one-third of which were to be wholesaled through other providers. Telecom failed to achieve the number of wholesale connections required, despite an attempt by management to claim that the agreement had been for only one-third of the growth rather than one-third of the total. That claim was rejected by the Commerce Commission, and the publicized figure of 83,333 wholesale connections out of 250,000 was held to be the true target. The achieved number was less than 50,000 wholesale connections, despite total connections exceeding 300,000. On May 3, 2006, the government announced it would require the unbundling of the local loop. This was in response to concerns about the low levels of broadband uptake. Regulatory action such as information disclosure, the separate accounting of Telecom New Zealand business operations, and enhanced Commerce Commission monitoring was announced. On August 9, 2007, Telecom released the keys to exchanges in Glenfield and Ponsonby in Auckland. In March 2008, Telecom activated ADSL 2+ services from 5 Auckland exchanges: Glenfield, Browns Bay, Ellerslie, Mount Albert and Ponsonby, with further plans for the rest of Auckland and other major centres, allowing other ISPs to take advantage. Switzerland Switzerland is one of the last OECD nations to provide for unbundling, because the Swiss Federal Supreme Court held in 2001 that the 1996 Swiss Telecommunications Act did not require it. The government then enacted an ordinance providing for unbundling in 2003, and Parliament amended the Act in 2006. While infrastructure-based access is now generally available, unbundled fast bitstream access is limited to a period of 4 years after the entry into force of the Act. Unbundling requests tend to be tied up before the courts, however, because unlike in the EU, Swiss law does not provide for an ex-ante regulation of access conditions by the regulator. Instead, under the Swiss ex-post regulation system, each new entrant must first try to reach an individual agreement with Swisscom, the state-owned ALll. Hong Kong mandatory local loop unbundling policy in Hong Kong, started on July 1, 1995, to ensure choice to customers. After 10 years, new operators have built their networks covering a large region of Hong Kong. The government considered it a good time to withdraw mandatory local loop unbundling policy, to persuade operators to build their own networks and let businesses run themselves with a minimum of government intervention. At the meeting of the Executive Council on July 6, 2004, the government decided that the regulatory intervention under the current Type 2 interconnection policy applicable to telephone exchanges for individual buildings covered by such exchanges should be withdrawn, subject to conditions documented in the Statement of the Telecommunications Authority. After that, the terms of interconnection will be negotiated between telephone operators. Hong Kong is the only advanced economy that has withdrawn the mandatory local loop unbundling policy. South Africa On May 25, 2006, the Minister of Communications of South Africa Drive IV Matsep Kasaburi established the Local Loop Unbundling Committee chaired by Professor Tshilidzi Mawala to recommend the appropriate local loop unbundling models. The Local Loop Unbundling Committee submitted a report to Minister Matsep Kasaburi on May 25, 2007. This report recommends that models that permit customers to access both voice and data be offered by many different companies. The models recommended are full unbundling, line sharing and bitstream access. It is recommended that customers should exercise carrier pre-selection and thus be able to switch between service providers. It is also recommended that an organization be created to manage the local loop and that this organization should be under the guidance of the regulator ICASA and that ICASA be capacitated in terms of resources. The committee recommended that service providers approved by ICASA should have access to the telephone exchange infrastructure whenever necessary. The committee recommended that a regulatory guideline be established and be managed by ICASA to guarantee that strategic issues like quality of the local loop be optimized for regulation and delivery of services. Based on this report, the Minister has issued policy directives to ICASA to move swiftly with the unbundling process. At the end of March 2010 nothing has happened yet, however a deadline of November 1, 2011 was set by the Minister of Communications for monopoly holder, Telkom SA to finalize the unbundling process. See also, product bundling, sub-loop unbundling, loop management system, forced access regulation, local number portability, mobile number portability, unbundling in France. References, 47 U.S.C. A millisecond Section 251, c. 3. United States Code. Office of the Law Revision Council of the U.S. House of Representatives. Retrieved February 22, 2010. WTO Legal Texts, Marrakesh Agreement, WTO Services, Telecommunications, Negotiating Group on Basic Telecommunications April 24, 1996, News Office of the Telecoms Adjudicator, Charts Office of the Telecoms Adjudicator, Carphone Warehouse to acquire Time Warner's AOL Internet Access business in the UK for £370 million. Time Warner. October 11, 2006. Retrieved October 27, 2006. State of the Nation, Local Loop Unbundling ThinkBroadband.com. October 26, 2006. Retrieved October 28, 2006. Jerry A. Hausman and J. Gregory Sidak, did mandatory unbundling achieve its purpose? Empirical evidence from 5 countries, 1J Competition ALll. And ECON. 173, 208, https, www.criterioneconomics.com. Did mandatory unbundling achieve its purpose? 1 PDF. Unbundling policy in the United States, players, outcomes and effects. Quello Center for Telecommunication Management and Law. March 11, 2005. Archived from the original on December 2, 2008. Retrieved January 24, 2009. 1. Beehive, Government Moves Fast to Improve Broadband, Office of the Telecommunications Authority, Hong Kong Government. Interconnection Configurations and Basic Underlying Principles, Interconnection and Related Competition Issues Statement No. 6 inches. Retrieved October 19, 2009. Office of the Telecommunications Authority, Hong Kong Government. Interconnection and Related Competition Issues, Statement No. 1 inch. Retrieved October 19, 2009. Type 2 Interconnection to be withdrawn. Commerce, Industry and Technology Bureau. Office of the Telecommunications Authority, the Government of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. July 6, 2004. Retrieved April 15, 2008. Local Loop Unbundling, a Way Forward for South Africa. The Local Loop Unbundling Committee. May 23, 2007. Retrieved April 15, 2008. Further reading, OECD, Universal Service and Rate Restructuring in Telecommunications, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Publishing, 1991. ISBN 92-64-13497-2. External links, OECD, Developments in Local Loop Unbundling, ALll Exchange List, EU Telecommunications Liberalization Framework, Local Loop Unbundling, What is it? ALll Availability, Mac Codes, UK Guide for obtaining your Mac code.